I try to make sure that I incorporate multiple opportunities throughout the semester for students to give me feedback. Traditionally you can have like a end of the semester review and even like a mid-semester review, but I try to create spaces and opportunities for students to tell me what they're struggling with throughout the course. And so that can be anonymous index cards every couple of weeks, or depending on your course structure, once a week, that's saying, okay, here are the things that I found most interesting to learn this course. Here's what really intrigued me, and then here are the things that I'm still struggling with.
Something that I've used is Slido.com, which is a website where students can post questions and upvote each other's questions. And I find that to be something that helps students who would otherwise not feel comfortable raising their hand and voicing a question.
Another activity that is very helpful to do on the first day or within the first few days of the semester is creating a community norms document. And when I've done that in the past with students, we use a website like Slido, and students using that website can all contribute an idea that they have to create community norms for themselves. And so they have a lot of participation in that creation of that document. They have agency over it, and they get to decide and reflect on, how do I feel respected? How do I respect other people? And how can I respect my instructor? And we create those guidelines for ourselves that we can refer back to in later weeks.
Especially if you're having a course that has a lot of discussion and might in particular ask students to discuss sensitive topics or topics that are not, always discussed day to day. I think it's helpful to then have students agree upon early on in a course a set of guidelines for those discussions. And in particular, I found really helpful resources around how to deal with moments where those guidelines aren't met. So what do you do in a course when you're having a discussion and someone says something that's particularly marginalizing or reifies, an ism, racism, sexism, ableism, things like that. How do we, as instructors, navigate that? And I think that can feel really intimidating for us as TAs, but I think in some ways, if we have a set of guidelines from the start, that can be really helpful to then go back to those guidelines as a way to navigate that discussion.
So one of the things I do sometimes at the beginning of the semester is to give 2 Post-its to each student at the first discussion section, and on one Post-it to ask them to write what they could receive from their peers, what they want from their peers, and the other, what they could offer to their peers. And then when they're all done, it's anonymous. They stick their Post-its up in 2 sections of a blackboard, and I'll read them out. And we'll have a discussion about what it means to be a successful and safe learning environment together, what it is that the students themselves want. And this is a way that they can themselves dictate a little bit what it means to create a space where everyone feels like they can contribute.
I am mostly teaching discussion sections, and one of the issues that we are usually having is that students are reluctant to participate for a variety of reasons. So what I'm trying to do on the first day of class is explain what participation looks like for me, how is this being assessed, and what the expectations are. Because participation is a very broad term and a lot of instructors mean it in completely different ways.
So the most helpful thing to facilitate the kinds of critical engagement and learning that I think we value is to act as a guide for conversation, to piece together a cohesive thread across the diverse contributions of your students, rather than going in with an agenda that you feel like you have to stick to. So I lay out key themes and concepts and points of discussion that I would like to see occur in the classroom. But I also work really hard to have discussion occur in such a way that students are the ones raising those points, and sometimes to steer conversation a little bit to touch on really important issues that need to be covered as they relate to course material.
One way that I've worked to make my classroom more inclusive, and especially to make discussions more inclusive, is to really take the pressure off the individual student and instead design activities that really allow for each student to participate in a lower stakes way.
A lot of students also find that breaking up into small groups is particularly helpful for their learning. In just about every discussion section, I have some form of small group engagement, think, pair, share activity, or something that allows students to talk either one-on-one with another student or in small groups and work together. Group work is actually really helpful in allowing students to critically engage one another without feeling like they're overshadowed by a larger classroom at times.
One example of a small group activity that really requires wide participation from each student is a simple think, pair, share activity. So often during discussion, I'll have students pair off, maybe in groups of 2, maybe in groups of 3, and they'll talk about a particular question that I've posed to the group or that another student has posed to the group, and then they take notes on what their group discusses, and one of them will then report back to the full group.
A lot of students come into a STEM class with a lot of anxiety and fear that they're not going to do well because they didn't have a relevant, solid foundation beforehand. To help reduce this kind of anxiety or fear of embarrassing themselves or appearing less intelligent in front of their peers, I would always give them plenty of time to think on their own and work in pairs before giving me any of the answer to any of my questions. And I also use technology to collect anonymous response for the answers to the questions so that no one would feel exposed if they make mistakes.
In APMA workshop, I met students with different mathematical background. I usually make sure where they are in solving specific problems before I give the tailored help.
A lot of times what's happening is that the students do know the concepts and they do remember certain things from the lecture, but maybe not the exact facts, or maybe there are some misconceptions that's preventing them from making the right choice or getting the right calculation. In that case, it is more important to catch that misconception or the knowledge that they're missing so that they can remember where they got it wrong, instead of the impression that I got this question wrong, therefore I don't know anything. And I think this applies to grading as well. Giving partial credits is really important because when people know that they got something right, even though the final answer was wrong, knowing exactly where they got it right and where they got it wrong can help them better differentiate the things that they already know and the things they need to focus on when they're studying for exam in the future.
Also, any imperfect answer or opinion is valued, since the goal of the class conversation is not only judging by true or false. The form of the conversation is also not limited to instruction questions and students' response. It involves students asking questions, students talking with each other, and making things public.
Another thing that I found helpful is that during discussion section or during office hours, it's better to ask your students to go over the steps that they would have taken to solve a problem before you walk through the questions for them. Because when they are explaining things and verbalizing everything, maybe they can spot their own misconceptions and self-correct in that way. And then also at the same time, you can have a better understanding if they are struggling with certain concepts or if they have certain misconceptions, so that you know where to focus.
I find concept comparing or mapping very helpful to students, since concepts in STEM classes are sometimes very complex and usually based on the ones they've learned. I use YouTube video as a teaching technique. I recorded my step-by-step solutions in video format and upload them to my YouTube channel, so that students will be able to check what they missed after they submit their homework, since the solution key don't always tell enough.
I will often have students assign themselves a code or a number for tests. Instead of writing their name, they just write down this code. And they get a new one for each test, so that when I'm grading, I don't know who it is. I can't have any implicit bias related to a name or anything like that. I'm just measuring how well they did on the test.
One thing I always try to keep in mind is if I don't know something, I would let my student know and tell them that I'll get back to them later. I think it doesn't hurt to show the students that there's something that you don't know either and that they asked a good question. And I think seeing the TA not knowing the answer sometimes would also help them reduce that kind of anxiety that they should be knowing everything and they should get everything right. And they could also encourage them to make mistakes and self-correct and discover what they should focus on and what are their blind spots in the course.